Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. We had been looking forward to our summer vacation for months. Emma, Sarah, Brian, and I rented a luxurious villa for a week. The place was beautiful, with a large pool, spacious rooms, and a stunning view of the ocean. We felt like we had found paradise. The first day went by smoothly. We swam, grilled some food, and enjoyed the sunshine. That night, we all retired to our rooms, exhausted from the fun-filled day. I remember feeling a sense of contentment as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Sarah was the first to mention it. She had found a small, black object in her room. It was a camera. We all gathered in her room, staring at it in disbelief. Who would put a camera in here? We checked our own rooms and, to our horror, found more hidden cameras. They were placed discreetly, but once you knew where to look, they were obvious. Panic set in. We realized someone had been watching us. Our conversations, our private moments, everything. Brian suggested we call the police, but Emma was afraid it would ruin our vacation. We decided to first search the villa for any other signs of tampering. As we went through each room, we found more cameras. They were hidden in the living room, the kitchen, even the bathrooms. Our sense of violation grew with each discovery. Brian found a small, locked door in the basement. We managed to break it open, revealing a room full of screens and recording equipment. Someone had been monitoring us closely. We had to find out who was behind this. Emma checked the rental agreement and found the owner's contact information. She called and demanded answers, but the person on the other end acted surprised and denied any knowledge of the cameras. It felt like a dead end. While we were debating our next steps, Brian noticed a car parked down the road. It had been there since we arrived, and we hadn't thought much of it. He suggested we keep an eye on it, in case someone returned to the villa. That night, we set up a watch. Each of us took turns staying awake and monitoring the house. Around 2 a.m., Sarah woke me up, whispering urgently. The car was gone. Someone had moved it while we were inside. We decided to search the area around the villa. Brian and I went outside while Emma and Sarah stayed inside, locking all the doors. We circled the property, shining our flashlights into the darkness. The night was eerily silent, and every little sound made us jump. As we approached the edge of the property, Brian noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. They led away from the villa and into the woods. We followed them cautiously, our hearts pounding. After a few minutes, we saw a figure in the distance. They were crouched, watching the villa through binoculars. We confronted the person, who turned out to be a middle-aged man. He was startled and tried to run, but Brian tackled him to the ground. We restrained him and called the police. When they arrived, they took him into custody and searched his car. Inside, they found more recording equipment and notes detailing our activities. It turned out the man was a voyeur who had been renting out the villa to unsuspecting guests and filming them. He had been doing this for years, selling the footage online. The police assured us he would face severe charges. The experience left us all shaken. We couldn't believe how close we had come to being exploited. The rest of our vacation was tense and uncomfortable. We felt watched even though the cameras were gone. The villa, once a paradise, now felt like a prison. When we finally left, we were relieved. The memories of that week would haunt us for a long time. We learned to be more cautious and aware of our surroundings. Privacy is a precious thing, and once it's invaded, it's hard to feel safe again. I still think about that man sometimes. What drove him to do such a thing? I guess we'll never really know. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the fear and violation we felt during what was supposed to be a carefree vacation. I always wanted to explore the jungle. It sounded like an adventure, so when I got the chance to visit South America, I jumped at it. I arrived at a small town near the jungle and found a guide, a local named Raul. He seemed friendly and knowledgeable, perfect for the trip I had in mind. We set off early in the morning, the air humid and buzzing with insects. Raul led the way, cutting through the thick foliage with his machete. I followed closely, eager to see the wonders of the jungle. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. The town was miles away, and it was just the two of us surrounded by towering trees and dense underbrush. Raul seemed to know his way around well. He pointed out various plants and animals, explaining their uses and dangers. His knowledge was impressive, and I felt like I was in good hands. After a few hours, we reached a small clearing, and Raul suggested we take a break. We sat down, drank some water, and chatted about the jungle and its secrets. After the break, Raul said he knew a spot deeper in the jungle that few tourists ever see. It sounded intriguing, so I agreed to follow him. As we walked, the path became less distinct, and I started to feel uneasy. The dense vegetation seemed to close in around us, and the sounds of the jungle grew louder. Raul's demeanor began to change. He became quieter, his answers short and clipped. I noticed he was glancing at me more frequently, his eyes hard and calculating. My unease grew, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We reached another clearing, smaller than the first. Raul stopped and turned to face me. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, menacing look. He told me that this part of the jungle was dangerous and that it would be easy for someone to get lost and never be found. A chill ran down my spine. I realized I had made a mistake trusting him. I tried to remain calm, asking him what he meant by that. Raul took a step closer, his hand resting on the handle of his machete. He told me he needed my money and belongings, and if I wanted to leave the jungle alive, I would give them to him without a fuss. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to think fast. I handed over my wallet and watch, trying to buy some time. Raul seemed pleased, but I could see he wasn't done yet. He demanded I give him everything, including my backpack and camera. I complied, my mind racing with possible escape plans. Raul then gestured for me to start walking back the way we came. He followed closely, his machete glinting in the dim light. I knew I couldn't outrun him, but I had to try something. As we walked, I kept an eye out for anything I could use to my advantage. We came to a narrow path with dense underbrush on either side. I pretended to trip, falling to the ground. Raul laughed, but as he moved to help me up, I grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it in his face. He yelled, blinded for a moment, and I took off running. Branches scratched my face and arms as I barreled through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Raul shouting behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The jungle seemed endless, a maze of trees and vines. I stumbled into a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The water was cool against my burning skin, but I didn't stop. I could still hear Raul in the distance, getting closer. I spotted a large tree with thick, low branches and scrambled up, hoping to hide. I climbed as high as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. From my perch, I watched as Raul entered the clearing below. He looked around, frustrated, but didn't see me. After a few minutes, he cursed and moved on. I stayed in the tree until I was sure he was gone. My muscles ached, and my clothes were torn and muddy. Carefully, I climbed down and continued following the stream, praying it would lead me to safety. I knew I couldn't go back the way I came, and I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town. Hours passed, and the jungle began to thin out. I stumbled into another clearing, this one with a small hut. An old man was sitting outside, and when he saw me, he rushed over. He spoke little English, but he understood enough to know I was in trouble. He gave me water and let me rest while he contacted the authorities. It took a while, but eventually help arrived. They found Raul's trail and arrested him. I learned later that he had been robbing and threatening tourists for years, using his knowledge of the jungle to his advantage. I was shaken but relieved to be safe. The experience left me with a deep respect for the jungle and a wary eye for those who offer their help too easily. Tom and I decided to spend our summer vacation at a remote cabin far from the city. It was meant to be a romantic getaway, just the two of us. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, with a beautiful lake nearby. It seemed perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon. The place was quiet and peaceful. There was no one around for miles, which was exactly what we wanted. The cabin itself was charming, with a rustic feel and all the essentials we needed. After unpacking, we went for a walk by the lake. The water was calm, and the scenery was breathtaking. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. We spent hours just talking and enjoying each other's company. It was the perfect start to our vacation. When we returned to the cabin, I found a note on the front door. It was handwritten and looked old. The note warned us about a local who targets tourists, urging us to be careful and lock the doors at night. I showed it to Tom, and we both laughed it off, thinking it was just a prank. We cooked dinner together, enjoying the simplicity of the cabin life. After dinner, we sat by the fireplace, talking about our plans for the week. It was getting dark outside, and the woods were eerily silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. As the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The note kept playing in my mind. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I told Tom, and he reassured me that we were safe. We locked all the doors and windows, just to be sure. We went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside made me jump. I kept imagining someone lurking in the shadows, watching us. I got up several times to check the locks and look out the windows, but there was nothing. Around midnight, I heard a noise coming from outside. It sounded like footsteps, slowly approaching the cabin. I woke Tom, and we both listened, holding our breath. The footsteps stopped right outside our window. Tom grabbed a flashlight and peered outside. There was nothing there. He tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We stayed up for hours, listening for any other sounds, but it was quiet again. In the morning, we found strange footprints around the cabin. They were large and led into the woods. It looked like someone had been circling the cabin, watching us. The sense of unease grew stronger. We decided to stay close to the cabin that day. We didn't want to venture too far, just in case. As we sat on the porch, we noticed movement in the trees. It was quick, like someone darting between the trees. Every time we looked, it was gone. By evening, we were both on edge. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. We tried to keep ourselves busy, but the fear was always there. We kept all the lights on and the doors locked. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more deliberate. Someone was definitely outside, and they weren't trying to be quiet. Tom and I huddled together, terrified. We heard tapping on the windows, moving from one window to the next. Tom decided to confront whoever it was. He grabbed a kitchen knife and opened the door, shouting into the darkness. There was no response, just silence. He stepped outside, and I followed, holding my breath. We scanned the area with the flashlight, but there was no one there. The footprints were fresh, leading into the woods again. Tom decided we should leave first thing in the morning. It was too dangerous to stay. We went back inside and tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. The footsteps returned, this time accompanied by a low, menacing laugh. It was chilling, echoing through the woods. We knew we had to leave, but we were trapped until morning. At dawn, we packed our things quickly and got into the car. As we drove away, I looked back and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. It was a man, tall and thin, with a twisted smile on his face. We reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. They said there had been reports of similar incidents but had never caught the person responsible. We were just glad to be safe. I decided to rent a house in the countryside for the summer, hoping to finish my book. The place was quiet, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors in sight except for one house in the distance. It seemed perfect for writing. The first few days were peaceful. I wrote in the mornings, took long walks in the afternoons, and spent evenings reading by the fireplace. It was idyllic. But then I started noticing something strange. My neighbor was always outside, watching my house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe he was just enjoying his garden. But it started to feel like every time I looked up, he was there, staring. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. I had work to do. One evening, as I was walking back from the village, I saw him standing at the edge of his property, just watching me. His expression was blank, almost menacing. I nodded a greeting, but he didn't respond, just kept staring. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, like someone was walking around the house. I told myself it was just animals, but deep down, I was scared. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around my house. They were too big to be mine. I decided to do some research on my neighbor. The village librarian was helpful, though she seemed hesitant to talk about him. She finally told me his name was Mr. Harris, and he had a troubling past. Years ago, he was a suspect in the disappearance of a young woman, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. That information made my blood run cold. I started to feel like I was being watched all the time. I kept the curtains closed and tried to focus on my writing, but it was hard. Every creak, every rustle outside made me jump. One afternoon, I saw Mr. Harris standing at the edge of his property again, just watching. It was unnerving. I decided to confront him, hoping to put an end to this. I walked over, my heart pounding. As I approached, he didn't move or say anything, just kept staring. I asked him politely if there was a reason he was always watching my house. He didn't answer, just kept staring with that blank expression. It was like talking to a statue. Finally, he muttered something about making sure everything was safe and walked away. That night, I was even more on edge. I kept hearing noises, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Around midnight, I heard a tapping on my window. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I walked to the window and peeked out. There was nothing there, just darkness. The next morning, I found more footprints around the house. They led to my windows and back door. I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with Mr. Harris lurking around. I started packing my things, planning to leave that evening. As I was loading my car, I saw Mr. Harris standing at the edge of his property again. This time, he had a smile on his face, a creepy, knowing smile. It sent chills down my spine. I got in my car and drove to the village, deciding to spend the night at a small inn there. I told the innkeeper about my experience, and she looked concerned. She said I wasn't the first person to feel uneasy around Mr. Harris. She advised me to leave and not come back. I didn't need convincing. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the city the next day. That night at the inn, I felt safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept the lights on and barely slept. The next morning, I drove back to the house, quickly loaded the rest of my things, and left. As I drove away, I saw Mr. Harris standing on his porch, watching me leave. I reported my concerns to the local police, but they didn't seem too interested. Without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I was just glad to be out of there. The whole experience left me shaken. I never finished my book, but I was safe, and that was all that mattered. Now, every time I think about renting a place in the countryside, I remember Mr. Harris and those watching eyes. Our summer road trip was going great until the car broke down in the middle of nowhere. It was me, Mike, and my friends, Jack and Lisa. We tried to call for help, but there was no signal. We were stuck. We decided to wait by the car, hoping someone would come by and help us. After what felt like hours, a truck finally pulled up. The driver was an older man with a friendly smile. He offered to give us a ride to the nearest town, which he said was about 20 miles away. We were relieved and grateful. We climbed into his truck, thanking him profusely. As we drove, the man's demeanor changed. He started asking us strange questions about where we were going and if anyone knew we were out here. His friendly smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. We exchanged nervous glances, but tried to stay calm. The road we were on was unfamiliar. It didn't look like it led to any town. Jack, who was sitting up front, tried to make small talk, asking about the area. The man gave short, vague answers, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, watching us. I could feel the tension in the truck growing. Lisa whispered to me that something felt off. I agreed. We needed to find a way out of this situation. Jack asked if we could stop for a bathroom break, hoping we could make a run for it. The man hesitated but then pulled over at a secluded spot. We all got out, trying to act casual. Lisa and I stayed close together while Jack went behind some bushes. The man watched us intently, not getting out of the truck. Jack returned, nodding slightly to us. We all got back into the truck, but now we were on high alert. As we drove, the man suddenly took a sharp turn off the main road onto a dirt path. Panic set in. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady. He said there was a shortcut, but it was clear he was lying. The dirt path was rough, leading deeper into the woods. Jack tried to reason with the man, asking him to let us out, saying we'd find our own way. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He didn't respond. The tension was unbearable. We needed to act fast. Lisa grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. I could see the fear in her eyes. Jack whispered to us to be ready to jump out when the truck slowed down. The man seemed to sense our plan. He sped up, making the path even rougher. We were being jolted around in the back, holding on for dear life. Suddenly, the truck hit a large rock, and we were thrown against the seats. The truck came to a halt, the engine sputtering. The man cursed under his breath and got out to check the damage. This was our chance. Jack opened the door quietly, and we all scrambled out, running into the woods. We ran as fast as we could, the sounds of the man's angry shouts fading behind us. The woods were thick, branches scratching at our faces and arms. We didn't know where we were going, just that we needed to get away. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in gasps. After what felt like an eternity, we found a small clearing. We stopped to catch our breath, listening for any signs of a man. It was eerily quiet. We needed to find help. Jack climbed a tree to see if he could spot any signs of civilization. He saw a small cabin in the distance. We made our way to the cabin, hoping someone there could help us. As we approached, we saw an old woman sitting on the porch. She looked up, surprised to see us. We explained our situation, begging for help. She took us inside, locking the door behind us. The woman gave us water and let us use her phone to call for help. We stayed inside, every noise outside making us jump. It felt like hours before the police arrived. They took our statements and went to look for the man. We never found out what his intentions were, but we were safe. The police escorted us to the nearest town, where we were able to call for a tow truck and get our car fixed. The road trip was over, and we just wanted to go home. I was driving back home from a summer vacation when I noticed flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I pulled over, thinking it was a routine traffic stop. The man who approached my car was wearing a police uniform, but something about him felt off. His badge looked strange, and his uniform didn't fit right. He asked for my license and registration, and I handed them over. His eyes darted around nervously, and he kept looking back at his car. I felt uneasy, but I tried to stay calm. He told me I was speeding and needed to step out of the car. I hesitated, but then he raised his voice, demanding I get out. As I stepped out, I noticed his car didn't have any official markings. It looked like a regular car with a light bar slapped on top. My heart started pounding. I realized this man wasn't a real police officer. I had to think fast. I asked him if I could grab my phone to call my husband, pretending he was waiting for me at home. The man frowned but nodded. I got back into my car and grabbed my phone, quickly dialing 911. I kept my eyes on him, trying not to let him see what I was doing. When the operator answered, I whispered that I was pulled over by someone pretending to be a cop and gave them my location. The man started walking towards my car again. I ended the call and pretended to be talking to my husband. I told him loudly that everything was fine and I'd be home soon. The man opened my door and motioned for me to get out again. I nodded and pretended to comply. As I stepped out, I noticed a car approaching in the distance. I waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The man grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back towards his car. I struggled, kicking at him and screaming for help. The approaching car slowed down, and the driver rolled down their window, asking what was going on. The man let go of me and hurried back to his car, speeding off down the road. The driver of the other car got out and asked if I was okay. I was shaking, but I managed to explain what happened. They stayed with me until the police arrived. When the real police showed up, I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they'd look for the impersonator. They said there had been reports of similar incidents in the area recently. I was lucky to have gotten away unharmed. The police escorted me home, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close I came to being taken by that man. I was grateful for the driver who stopped to help me. If they hadn't come along, I don't know what would have happened. For days, I felt like I was being watched. Every car that drove by my house made me jump. I couldn't sleep, kept replaying the encounter in my mind. I was scared to leave my house, scared to drive alone. My family tried to comfort me, but the fear was overwhelming. I decided to take a self-defense class and learned how to protect myself in case something like this ever happened again. It helped a little, knowing I could defend myself, but the fear never fully went away. I stayed in touch with the police, who told me they were still searching for the man. Months passed, and there was still no news. The incident haunted me, but I tried to move on with my life. I became more cautious, always checking my surroundings, never driving alone at night. The memory of that summer day stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. I shared my story with friends and family, warning them to be careful. I didn't want anyone else to go through what I did. It felt good to raise awareness, but the fear remained. Every time I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror, my heart would race, and my hands would tremble. Eventually, I moved to a new city, hoping a change of scenery would help me forget. It didn't. The fear followed me, but I learned to live with it. I became more vigilant, always on guard, never letting my guard down. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to escape. It could have ended so differently. I will never forget the man who pretended to be a cop, who tried to take me. I wanted to do something different for my summer vacation, so I decided to sneak into the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. I had heard stories about it, but I didn't believe half of them. It was supposed to be haunted or cursed, but I knew those were just tales to keep kids away. The park had been closed for years. Weeds grew through the cracks in the pavement, and rust covered the rides. I managed to find a hole in the fence and slipped through, my heart pounding with excitement and a bit of fear. I had my flashlight and my phone, thinking I'd take some cool photos to show my friends. As I wandered through the park, I noticed how silent it was. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my footsteps on the cracked ground. I went past the Ferris wheel, its metal creaking in the wind, and headed towards the old funhouse. That's when I saw the light. It was faint at first, coming from the direction of the bumper cars. I thought maybe it was another thrill-seeker like me. But as I got closer, I realized it was a group of men. They were talking in hushed voices, their faces serious. I hid behind a broken game booth and watched. They were unloading boxes from a van, placing them in one of the old maintenance buildings. My curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer, trying to hear what they were saying. I accidentally kicked a bottle, sending it rolling across the pavement. The men stopped talking and looked around, their flashlights sweeping the area. I ducked behind a trash can, my heart racing. I heard one of them say something about a shipment and a deadline. It hit me then that these weren't just guys hanging out in an old amusement park, they were up to something illegal. I had to get out of there. I waited until they went back to their work before making my move. I tried to sneak back the way I came, but one of the men saw me. He shouted, and the others turned their flashlights on me. I ran as fast as I could, hearing them chasing after me. I zigzagged through the park, past the roller coaster and the haunted house. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, and I could hear them gaining on me. I ducked into the old carousel building, hoping to lose them in the darkness. I crouched behind one of the horses, trying to control my breathing. The men entered the building, their flashlights sweeping the area. I heard them talking, their voices angry. They spread out, searching. I stayed as still as I could, my mind racing with plans to escape. One of the men walked right past me, his flashlight inches from my face. I held my breath until he moved on. I needed to find a way out. I spotted a back door and made a break for it. I burst through the door, running into the night. I could hear them behind me, shouting and cursing. I ran towards the Ferris wheel, hoping to find a place to hide. I climbed up the rusted frame, my hands slipping on the metal. I reached one of the carriages and climbed inside, pulling the door shut behind me. I could see the men below, their flashlights searching the ground. They didn't think to look up. I waited there, my heart pounding, until the sun started to rise. The men finally gave up and left, taking their van and their boxes with them. I climbed down, my body aching from the tension and the cold. I made my way back to the hole in the fence and slipped through, vowing never to return. I went straight to the police station and told them everything. They took my statement and said they'd investigate. I don't know what happened after that, but I stayed away from that place. The thrill wasn't worth the fear and danger I felt that night. I've learned my lesson. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some thrills aren't worth the risk. I'll stick to safer adventures from now on. Rachel and I had planned our summer vacation for months. We found an Airbnb that looked perfect, a cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The photos showed a sunny living room, a small but clean kitchen, and a comfortable bedroom. The reviews were all positive, and the host, Craig, seemed friendly. We arrived in the early afternoon. Craig greeted us at the door. He was tall, with a friendly smile, and he welcomed us warmly. He showed us around the apartment, explaining how everything worked. At first, everything seemed fine. He gave us his number and told us to call if we needed anything. It felt like the start of a relaxing vacation. After he left, Rachel and I unpacked and settled in. We decided to explore the neighborhood. There was a small cafe nearby, and we had a light lunch. When we returned, Craig was waiting outside the building. He smiled and asked how our day was going. It felt a bit strange, but we thought he was just being friendly. That evening, as we were cooking dinner, there was a knock on the door. It was Craig again. He said he was checking to make sure we had everything we needed. Rachel thanked him and said we were fine. He lingered for a moment before finally leaving. We exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. The next morning, we woke up to find a note slipped under our door. It was from Craig, reminding us that he lived nearby if we needed anything. There was something about his insistence that started to make us uncomfortable. Rachel suggested we go out for the day to avoid him. We spent the day at the beach, trying to relax. When we got back to the apartment, Craig was waiting outside again. He asked how our day was and if we needed anything. His constant presence was becoming unsettling. We politely declined his offer of help and went inside. That night, we heard footsteps outside our door. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth. Rachel and I sat up, listening. After a while, the footsteps stopped. We tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next day, we decided to cut our trip short. We packed our bags and planned to leave the following morning. That evening, as we were getting ready for bed, there was a loud knock on the door. Craig's voice called out, asking if everything was okay. We told him we were fine and that we needed some privacy. He didn't leave. He started knocking harder, demanding to be let in. Rachel and I were terrified. We called the police, but they said it would take some time to get there. We needed to find a way to keep Craig out until they arrived. We barricaded the door with a chair and a small table. Craig kept shouting, saying he knew we were hiding something. The pounding on the door grew louder. We retreated to the bedroom and locked the door, hoping it would hold until help arrived. The minutes felt like hours. We could hear Craig trying to break down the front door. Rachel and I held each other, too scared to speak. Finally, we heard sirens in the distance. Craig stopped pounding and there was silence. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, followed by a voice identifying itself as the police. We cautiously opened the door and let them in. Craig was nowhere to be seen. The officers took our statements and assured us they would find him. The police escorted us to a nearby hotel for the night. We were shaken but relieved to be safe. The next morning, we received a call from the police. They had found Craig hiding in a nearby alley. He was arrested and taken into custody. Rachel and I returned to the apartment with the police to gather our belongings. We left the keys on the kitchen counter and drove away, grateful to be leaving that nightmare behind. We decided to never stay in an Airbnb again. The experience left us wary of strangers and more appreciative of our safety. We returned home, still shaken but safe. It took a while for us to feel comfortable again, but we were glad to be back in familiar surroundings. I was on vacation in Barcelona, soaking up the summer sun and enjoying the vibrant energy of the city. Jake, my best friend, and I were exploring a bustling market that was packed with tourists and locals alike. The place was alive with color and noise, street performers, vendors shouting their specials, and the smell of fresh food everywhere. We were in the middle of haggling over some souvenirs when I noticed Jake's backpack was open. I glanced over and saw him struggling to zip it up, distracted by a street artist's performance. Moments later, I felt a sharp pang of panic when I realized my passport, which was in the side pocket of his bag, was missing. I quickly told Jake, and we retraced our steps, searching every stall and corner of the market. Jake tried to stay calm, but I could see the worry on his face. We approached a few vendors and asked if they had seen anything suspicious. Most shook their heads or offered sympathetic looks but had no useful information. We decided to report the theft to the police. We went to a nearby station and filed a report. The officers were kind and promised to look into it, but I could tell they were swamped with cases. They suggested we keep an eye on the market, as thefts like this were common in busy areas. Jake and I went back to the market, keeping a low profile, hoping the thief might return or that we could spot someone acting suspiciously. After hours of watching people come and go, we were about to give up when Jake noticed a man who kept glancing our way. He was acting strangely, moving from one stall to another with a kind of furtive purpose. Jake suggested we follow him discreetly. We trailed behind the man, keeping a safe distance. The man led us out of the market and down a series of narrow alleys. The alleys were dark and dimly lit, giving me an uneasy feeling. The man finally stopped at a rundown building and slipped inside. We waited for a few minutes before approaching the building. It looked abandoned, but there was a faint light coming from a window on the second floor. Jake and I exchanged nervous glances before deciding to investigate. We crept up the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. As we reached the second floor, we could hear muffled voices. Jake peeked around the corner and saw the man talking to several other people. The room was filled with papers and what looked like stolen goods. It became clear that they were running a larger operation. Jake and I stayed hidden, trying to gather as much information as possible. One of the men was talking about passports and identification, which made my blood run cold. They were discussing selling stolen passports on the black market. I felt a rush of fear. They had my passport, and it seemed like they were planning something bigger. Realizing the danger we were in, we decided we needed to leave and get help. We slowly made our way back down the stairs, trying to avoid making any noise. Just as we reached the exit, one of the men from the group spotted us. We could hear him shouting, and soon, we heard footsteps pounding after us. Jake and I bolted through the alleys, our hearts racing. The narrow, winding streets made it difficult to know where we were going. We could hear the men shouting behind us, growing closer with each step. We had to think fast. We ducked into a small shop that looked closed but had a small space where we could hide. We huddled in the back, barely able to breathe. We could hear the men outside, searching and calling for us. The minutes felt like hours. After what seemed like an eternity, the voices outside faded away. We waited in silence, our ears straining to catch any sound. Once we were sure it was safe, we slowly made our way out of the shop and back to the main street. We found a nearby police station and explained everything to them. The officers took our statements and promised to investigate the building we had described. They advised us to stay in a secure location and not return to the market until the situation was resolved. Jake and I returned to our hotel, shaken but relieved. The police eventually recovered my passport and arrested several people involved in the operation. It was a long process, but we were grateful that we were safe and that the criminals were caught. The rest of our vacation was subdued, and we spent the remaining days exploring the city in a more cautious manner. The experience was terrifying, but it taught us to stay alert and trust our instincts. We were thankful to be safe and able to return home without any further incidents. I was on a solo vacation in Miami, finally taking a break from work. I had booked a room at a small hotel right on the beach, hoping for some rest and relaxation. Everything seemed perfect when I arrived: sunshine, sand, and a view that made the long drive worthwhile. When I checked in, the receptionist gave me my key and directed me to my room. As I made my way to the elevator, I noticed a man standing outside our room with a suitcase. I assumed he was waiting for someone or maybe just checking in. I got to my room, opened the door, and was greeted by the familiar smell of hotel cleaning products. I unpacked my bags and settled in for a quiet evening. Just as I was about to unwind, I heard a knock on my door. It was the same man I had seen earlier. He introduced himself as Jason and told me there had been a mix-up with the booking system. It turned out that my room had been double booked. I was surprised but didn't think much of it. The hotel staff had already arranged for Jason to be moved to another room. He said he was just waiting for the new room to be ready and asked if he could hang out in mine until then. I agreed, thinking it was a minor inconvenience and that he seemed harmless enough. We chatted briefly, and he told me he was in town for a conference. After about an hour, Jason's room was ready. He thanked me and left. I locked my door behind him and felt relieved that the situation was resolved. That night, I heard some noise outside my room but dismissed it as people coming in late from the beach. I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I listened for any signs of trouble. I heard footsteps in the hallway and then a soft knock on my door. I peered through the peephole and saw Jason standing there. I was confused. I opened the door slightly and asked if everything was all right. He said he had forgotten something in my room and needed to come in to get it. I hesitated but eventually let him in. He looked nervous, and his demeanor had changed since earlier. He started looking around the room and seemed agitated. He told me he had misplaced some important documents and was getting anxious. I tried to calm him down and suggested we call the hotel staff for help. Jason snapped at me, saying he couldn't afford any delays. His voice was suddenly harsh, and I could see a different side of him that made me uneasy. I wanted to ask him to leave but didn't want to provoke him. As he continued to search the room, I noticed his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. He started pacing and muttering to himself. My instinct told me something was off, and I felt a growing sense of danger. I decided it was time to get him out of my room. I told him I needed to use the bathroom and asked him to wait outside. I slipped into the bathroom, locked the door, and quickly called the hotel front desk. I explained the situation and asked for help. The receptionist assured me they would send someone up right away. While I was on the phone, I heard Jason trying to open the bathroom door. His knocking turned into pounding, and I could hear him yelling. My heart pounded as I realized he was trying to force his way in. I stayed silent and listened for any sounds of movement outside. I could hear footsteps approaching my room and then the sound of the door opening. The hotel staff had arrived, and Jason's yelling grew louder before it abruptly stopped. After what felt like an eternity, there was a knock on the bathroom door. It was one of the hotel staff, asking if I was all right. I opened the door and quickly explained what had happened. They assured me that Jason had been restrained and that the police were on their way. The police arrived shortly after and took Jason into custody. He was charged with several offenses, including harassment and trespassing. The hotel staff apologized for the mix-up and offered to move me to a different room for the remainder of my stay. The rest of the vacation was uneventful, but the incident left me shaken. I was grateful for the quick response of the hotel staff and the police. I learned to trust my instincts and be more cautious, especially when dealing with strangers. Despite the scary experience, I managed to enjoy the rest of my trip, focusing on the beautiful beach and the relaxation I had initially sought. The hotel staff were supportive, and I felt safe once the situation was resolved. Tom and I decided to take a weekend trip out of the city to enjoy some quiet time. We found a cabin rental in a remote area that seemed perfect for relaxation. The drive was long but enjoyable, and the scenery was beautiful. We were looking forward to a peaceful few days away from work and stress. The first day went smoothly. We spent time hiking and exploring the area. The cabin was exactly what we had hoped for. The second day, we decided to explore a bit more and maybe find a scenic spot to have a picnic. The map showed a small trail that looked interesting, so we set out to find it. As we drove, the road became less paved and more rugged. We didn't think much of it, figuring it was just part of the adventure. We followed the directions on our GPS, but soon it started acting up. The signal was weak, and we ended up taking a wrong turn. Before we knew it, the trees around us thickened, and the road turned into a narrow, winding path. We didn't see any other cars or signs of civilization. I started to feel uneasy, but Tom kept reassuring me that we were just off the beaten path and would find our way back soon. After about an hour, we saw a small, dilapidated sign that read "Welcome to Pine Grove Community." The place looked run down, and the houses were spread out and seemed older. It was clear that this was not the scenic spot we had intended to visit. We decided to turn around and head back. That's when things started to go wrong. As we tried to retrace our route, we noticed a few people watching us from their porches and yards. Their stares were intense and made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it and hoped we would get out of there soon. Tom took another wrong turn, and we ended up deeper into the community. The roads were getting narrower, and the houses more isolated. I could see people moving around in the distance, but no one came up to us or offered assistance. The sense of unease grew as we saw a few locals gathered near a rundown building. They watched us closely, and I noticed some of them whispering to each other. I told Tom we should stop and ask for directions, but he seemed more focused on finding a way out quickly. We stopped at a small general store, hoping to get some help. Inside, the store was dimly lit and poorly stocked. The cashier was an older man who looked at us with a mix of curiosity and irritation. Tom asked for directions back to the main road, but the man's answers were vague and unhelpful. As we left the store, I saw a group of people standing outside, talking and pointing at our car. My heart began to race. It felt like we were being watched and followed. Tom tried to drive out, but the road signs and landmarks were no longer familiar. Suddenly, we found ourselves on a road that seemed to lead out of the community, but it was blocked by a makeshift barricade. A few locals stood there, looking stern and unfriendly. They waved us to stop, and Tom had no choice but to comply. One of the men approached our car. He was rough-looking and had an intimidating presence. He asked us what we were doing in their community. Tom tried to explain that we were lost and just wanted to leave, but the man's expression didn't soften. The man said we were not allowed to leave until we were properly checked. He seemed to be the leader, or at least in charge of the situation. I was terrified, feeling like something was seriously wrong. I whispered to Tom that we needed to get out of there quickly. Tom agreed, and while the man was distracted by a radio call, Tom started the car and tried to drive around the barricade. The locals started shouting and running towards us. My heart pounded as we raced down the road, trying to find any way out of this hostile place. We drove for what felt like hours, making several wrong turns and trying to avoid being followed. The local shouts grew faint behind us, but we didn't stop to check. We finally found a road that looked like it could lead back to a more populated area. After driving for a while, we saw a highway sign that brought us some relief. We were back on a known route and could see more cars on the road. We stopped at a rest area to catch our breath and gather ourselves. We couldn't believe what had just happened. The community had felt like a trap, and we were lucky to have escaped. We made our way back to the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. I was on summer vacation, enjoying the break from work. I decided to go exploring a cave I had heard about from some locals. It was off the beaten path, not marked on any maps. I figured it would be an adventure, something different from the usual tourist spots. I packed a flashlight, some snacks, and headed out early in the morning. The entrance to the cave was small, almost hidden by bushes. I squeezed through and found myself in a narrow tunnel. The air was cool and damp. I switched on my flashlight and started walking. The tunnel widened into a larger chamber with stalactites hanging from the ceiling. As I went deeper, I noticed a side passage. Curious, I turned into it. The passage was darker, and the air felt heavier. After a few minutes, I stumbled upon something unexpected. There were crates and bags piled up against the walls, covered in dust but not old. I opened one of the crates and found it filled with weapons. Another had bags of what looked like drugs. My heart started racing. I realized I had found a stash of illegal goods. I needed to get out of there and report this to the authorities. As I turned to leave, I heard voices echoing from the main chamber. Panic set in. The criminals must have returned. I quickly switched off my flashlight and hid behind a large rock. The voices got closer. I could hear them talking about their next shipment. My hands were sweating, and I tried to control my breathing. One of the men walked into the passage where I was hiding. I pressed myself against the rock, praying he wouldn't see me. He walked past me, inspecting the crates. I held my breath, afraid even the slightest sound would give me away. After a few tense moments, he turned and walked back to the main chamber. I could hear them discussing their plans, talking about how they had to move the stash soon. I knew I had to get out of there before they discovered me. I waited until their voices faded a bit, then slowly started to move. I crawled back towards the entrance, careful not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like it could give me away. Just as I reached the main chamber, I heard one of them say they needed to check the entrance. I froze. I could see the entrance from where I was hiding, and there was no way I could make it out without being seen. I looked around frantically and spotted a narrow crack in the wall. It looked like it might lead to another passage. I squeezed through the crack, barely fitting. It was dark and cramped, but I kept going. I could hear them talking louder now, their footsteps echoing. I moved as fast as I could, scraping my arms and legs on the rough rock. The passage opened up into another tunnel, and I could see a faint light ahead. I followed the light, hoping it was another exit. The tunnel led to a small opening that overlooked a steep drop. I could see the forest below and knew I had to climb down. I took a deep breath and started to descend, using the rocks and roots as handholds. It was slow and dangerous, but I couldn't stay in the cave. Halfway down, I heard shouts from above. They had found the passage I used and were coming after me. I moved faster, almost slipping a few times. My hands were raw and bleeding, but I kept going. I reached the bottom and ran into the forest, not looking back. I didn't stop running until I reached a road. I flagged down a car and asked the driver to take me to the nearest police station. I told them everything, and they sent officers to the cave. Later, they told me they found the stash and arrested the criminals. It was supposed to be the perfect summer vacation. My family and I had saved up for months to stay at this luxury resort. The place was beautiful, with pristine beaches, lush gardens, and every amenity you could imagine. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, and everything seemed perfect. The first couple of days were bliss. We swam in the pool, lounged on the beach, and enjoyed the all-inclusive meals. But on the third night, my husband, Mark, started feeling sick. He thought it was just something he ate, but by morning, he was much worse. I took him to the resort's clinic. The doctor there was calm, almost too calm, and gave him some pills. Mark slept most of the day, and I started to feel uneasy. That night, our kids, Emily and Jake, began to complain of stomach aches. Panic set in as they both got worse quickly. By the next morning, all three were too weak to leave the room. I called for a doctor again, but they were slow to respond. When they finally came, they just gave more pills and assured me it was a common bug. Something felt off. The staff's reassurances didn't match the severity of what was happening. I decided to skip the resort's meals and bought some groceries from a nearby store. I cooked in our small kitchen, hoping it would help, but there was no change. I spent the night watching over my family, unable to sleep. That's when I noticed a few staff members lingering outside our room, whispering to each other. The next day, I went to the front desk and demanded to speak with the manager. They gave me the runaround, saying he was busy. My frustration grew. I started to observe the staff more closely and noticed something strange. They seemed overly attentive, always watching us. My mind raced with possibilities. Why were they so interested in us? What was really happening? I decided to take matters into my own hands. I snuck out of the room and wandered around the resort, looking for answers. In the basement, I found a locked door with a keypad. I waited until a staff member approached and saw them enter the code. I memorized it and returned later when the coast was clear. Inside, I discovered a makeshift lab with medical equipment and files on various guests, including my family. My heart pounded as I read through the files. It looked like they had been experimenting with different drugs, testing their effects on guests. I took photos of the documents with my phone and hurried back to the room. I needed to get my family out of there. When I returned, 2 staff members were in our room, trying to give my family more pills. I confronted them, and they became aggressive, insisting it was for their own good. I managed to get them out of the room and locked the door behind them. I packed our bags quickly and helped my husband and kids out of bed. They were weak, but we needed to leave. I called for a taxi, but none were available. The resort staff had likely anticipated this. We had no choice but to walk to the nearest town, a few miles away. The journey was slow and agonizing. My family could barely walk, and I was terrified we wouldn't make it. We finally reached a small clinic in the town. The local doctor was shocked at their condition and admitted them immediately. He confirmed my suspicions. They had been poisoned. I showed him the photos I took, and he contacted the authorities. My family was treated and started to recover, but the memory of that place haunted us. The resort was shut down, and the staff involved were arrested. It turned out they had been part of a larger operation, testing drugs on unsuspecting guests. Our perfect vacation turned into a nightmare, but we were lucky to get out alive. I was on a summer road trip, just me and the open road. I liked the freedom, the solitude. It was supposed to be a time to clear my head. One afternoon, I was driving through a quiet stretch of highway, fields on both sides, no other cars in sight. That's when I saw him, a guy standing by the side of the road, thumb out. He looked harmless enough, mid-30s, casual clothes, a small backpack. I decided to pick him up. I guess I was feeling generous or maybe just wanted someone to talk to. I pulled over, and he climbed in, thanking me profusely. He said his name was Dave, and he was trying to get to the next town over. We made small talk for a while, nothing serious. He seemed normal, grateful for the ride. But then, as we drove on, something about him started to feel off. It was little things at first. He kept glancing at me, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then he started asking questions, too many questions. Where was I from? Where was I going? Did I live alone? It put me on edge. I tried to keep the conversation light, but he kept steering it back to personal stuff. I noticed he was getting more tense, his hands clenching and unclenching. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't know how to get out of it. I was stuck in the car with him in the middle of nowhere. Then he asked if I could pull over so he could use the restroom. I did, hoping maybe he would just get out and not come back. But he didn't leave his bag in the car, and when he got back, he seemed even more on edge. As we got back on the road, he started talking about how he needed money and how people didn't trust him. It clicked. This guy wasn't just some random hitchhiker. He was desperate. I decided to stay calm, keep driving, and figure out a plan. I couldn't just kick him out in the middle of nowhere. That might set him off. I noticed a gas station coming up, and I told him I needed to stop for gas. He agreed, but I could see he was suspicious. At the gas station, I tried to act normal. I went inside to pay and grabbed a snack, all the while thinking about how to get help. I saw a payphone outside and made a quick decision. I told him I was going to make a quick call to my mom, just to check in. He watched me closely but stayed in the car. I dialed 911, keeping my back to the car, and whispered to the operator what was happening. They told me to stay calm and that help was on the way. I hung up and walked back to the car, trying to keep my cool. Dave was getting more agitated, asking why I was taking so long. I made up some excuse about my mom needing something. As I got back into the car, I saw a police cruiser pull into the gas station. My heart was pounding. I told Dave I needed to use the restroom one more time before we left. He was really suspicious now, but he let me go. I walked towards the bathroom, but once I was out of his sight, I ran to the police car. I quickly told the officer what was happening, and they moved fast. They approached my car and asked Dave to step out. He tried to run, but they were on him in seconds, pinning him to the ground. They found a knife in his bag and realized he was a wanted fugitive. My instincts had been right. The officers thanked me for keeping calm and getting help. I was in Las Vegas for my summer vacation, just trying to unwind and maybe get lucky at the casinos. I never expected to win big, but there I was, sitting at a blackjack table with a massive pile of chips in front of me. I couldn't believe my luck. I cashed out, and they handed me a thick envelope full of money. I felt like I was on top of the world. As I walked out of the casino, I noticed a group of guys who had been hanging around the blackjack tables. They were watching me closely. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but when I stepped outside, I saw them again. They were talking among themselves, glancing my way. I tried to shake it off and headed to the parking lot. My car was parked a little far from the entrance, and as I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. The group was following me, keeping a distance but definitely on my trail. My heart started to race. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to panic. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm. I reached my car and quickly got in, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, hoping I could lose them in traffic. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw their car pulling out too, following me. I drove aimlessly for a while, taking random turns, trying to shake them off. But they were persistent, sticking to me no matter where I went. I needed a plan. I remembered there was a police station a few blocks away. If I could just get there, I'd be safe. I made a sharp turn and headed towards the station, but their car sped up, closing the gap between us. I could see the determination in their eyes, and it scared the hell out of me. I had to think fast. I spotted a crowded shopping mall up ahead and decided to pull in. I parked my car and ran into the mall, hoping to lose them in the crowd. I weaved through people, looking for a security guard or a safe place to hide. I saw a sign for the restrooms and ducked inside, hiding in a stall. My heart was pounding, and I could barely catch my breath. I heard the door to the restroom open, and my stomach dropped. They were in here, looking for me. I stayed as quiet as I could, trying not to make a sound. I heard their footsteps, the murmur of their voices. They were checking each stall, one by one. When they reached mine, they kicked the door open. I acted on instinct, shoving one of them back and bolting out of the restroom. I ran through the mall, dodging shoppers, my mind racing. I needed to find help. I saw a security guard near the entrance and ran to him, yelling for help. The guard saw the panic in my eyes and stepped in front of me, blocking the thugs who were chasing me. He called for backup on his radio, and within minutes, more guards arrived. The thugs hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered. They backed off, blending into the crowd and disappearing. I explained everything to the guards, and they escorted me to a safe room. They called the police, who arrived and took my statement. They told me I was lucky to have escaped, that these guys were known for targeting big winners at the casinos. I felt a mix of relief and fear, knowing how close I had come to losing everything. The police took me to my car and made sure I got back to my hotel safely. I spent the rest of my vacation looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I was grateful to be safe, but the experience left a scar. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts. Winning big at the casino was supposed to be a dream come true, but it wasn't. I had been looking forward to my summer vacation all year. I booked a cozy beachside cottage for a week of relaxation and morning runs on the shore. The first few days were perfect. The sun rose early, casting a golden glow over the water. I'd lace up my running shoes and head out for a peaceful jog along the sand, the waves crashing gently beside me. On the third morning, I noticed him. He was sitting on a bench, just watching the ocean. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people come to the beach to enjoy the view. But the next day, he was there again, in the same spot, eyes following me as I jogged past. I felt a little uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe he was just a regular at the beach. By the fifth day, it became harder to ignore. He was always there, always watching. His presence felt intrusive, like he was studying me. I started to change my running route, hoping to avoid him, but no matter which way I went, he would find a new spot to sit and stare. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I decided to test my theory. One morning, I cut my run short and headed back to the cottage through a different path, keeping an eye out for him. Sure enough, I saw him in the distance, following at a slow, steady pace. My heart raced. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside made me jump. I checked the locks on the doors and windows repeatedly. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That a man was sitting on a public beach? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. The next morning, I skipped my run. I stayed inside, peeking through the curtains. Around the usual time of my run, I saw him. He was walking slowly past the cottage, looking around, searching. My heart pounded in my chest. He knew where I was staying. I spent the day indoors, trying to figure out what to do. I called my friend back home, telling her about the man. She urged me to be careful and suggested I leave early. I didn't want to cut my vacation short, but the fear was becoming too much. That evening, as the sun was setting, I saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the beach, closer than ever before. His eyes locked onto mine through the window. I quickly shut the curtains and backed away, my hands trembling. This was more than just a passing interest. He was dangerous. I decided to leave first thing in the morning. I packed my bags, making sure everything was ready to go. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my things and hurried to the car. As I drove away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the driveway, watching me leave. I drove straight to the nearest police station and reported everything. They took my statement seriously and promised to look into it. They advised me to change my plans and avoid going back to the cottage. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I ended up staying at a friend's place for the rest of my vacation. The beach no longer felt safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those cold, watching eyes. The police contacted me a few days later. They said they found no trace of him and that he might have moved on. It wasn't very reassuring. Jenna and I had been looking forward to our summer vacation for months. We rented a farmhouse in a small town, hoping for some peace and quiet away from our busy city lives. The place was perfect, isolated, surrounded by fields, with a charming rustic look. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, excited to start our week of relaxation. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, greeted us warmly. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a friendly smile. He showed us around the house, pointing out the amenities and giving us tips about the area. Everything seemed fine, but something about his eyes made me uneasy. They were too sharp, too calculating. The first night was peaceful. We cooked dinner together, watched a movie, and then went to bed early. The silence of the countryside was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. I slept soundly, feeling safe in the old farmhouse. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a walk around the property. I noticed something odd, an old, rusty ladder leaning against the side of the house, just below one of the upstairs windows. It seemed out of place, but I shrugged it off. Maybe Mr. Thompson had been doing some repairs. Later that day, while Jenna was in the shower, I noticed a small hole in the ceiling of the living room. It looked like it had been drilled recently. I climbed onto a chair to get a closer look and realized it was a peephole. A chill ran down my spine. I decided not to tell Jenna yet, not wanting to ruin our vacation with my paranoia. That evening, Mr. Thompson came by to check on us. He was overly friendly, asking too many personal questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us, studying us. When he finally left, I told Jenna about the peephole. She laughed it off, saying I was being silly, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The following night, I woke up to a strange noise coming from downstairs. It was a soft creaking, like someone was walking on the old wooden floorboards. I got out of bed quietly and crept down the stairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was slightly ajar. I closed it and locked it, my heart pounding. In the morning, I found more evidence of Mr. Thompson's spying. A small camera hidden behind a picture frame in the hallway. I showed it to Jenna, and this time she didn't laugh. We decided to confront Mr. Thompson and then leave as soon as possible. We drove to his house, which was only a few miles away. He answered the door with his usual smile, but it faltered when he saw the camera in my hand. I demanded an explanation, but he denied everything, claiming he had no idea how the camera got there. His calm demeanor made my skin crawl. We went back to the farmhouse, packed our bags, and decided to leave that night. As we were loading the car, Mr. Thompson showed up. He was different this time, no smile, no friendliness. He stood in the driveway, blocking our way. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice cold. I told him to move, but he just stood there, staring at us. Jenna was shaking, and I could feel my own fear rising. I decided to drive around him, but as I got into the car, he lunged at me, trying to pull me out. Jenna screamed, and I fought him off, managing to slam the door and start the engine. We sped down the driveway, Mr. Thompson chasing after us. I didn't look back until we were on the main road, heading towards the nearest town. Jenna was crying, and I was trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. We went straight to the police station and reported everything. The officers took our statement and promised to investigate. We found a motel for the night, but neither of us could sleep. Every noise outside made us jump. The next day, the police contacted us. They had searched the farmhouse and found more cameras, as well as a hidden room in the attic filled with recording equipment. Mr. Thompson had disappeared, and they were now looking for him. We cut our vacation short and went back to the city. We rented a yacht for a summer party, just a few friends looking to enjoy the weekend. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a break from our routine lives. We set off from the marina on a bright Saturday morning. The sea was calm, the weather perfect. There were 6 of us on board, me, Matt, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friends Jake, Sarah, Tom, and Emily. We spent the first few hours relaxing, sunbathing, and swimming. The yacht was luxurious, with a spacious deck, a small kitchen, and a couple of cabins below deck. As the sun began to set, we gathered on the deck for drinks. We were laughing, music playing softly in the background. The sky was turning a beautiful shade of orange. Everything was perfect. Suddenly, we noticed a small boat approaching us. At first, we thought it was just another group of people enjoying the water. But as it got closer, we saw the men on board. They were armed. Panic set in. We didn't know what to do. The men boarded our yacht quickly. There were 3 of them, all wearing masks. They shouted at us to get down on the deck. We obeyed, terrified. One of them waved a gun around, making sure we understood who was in charge. They demanded to know where it was. We had no idea what they were talking about. One of the men grabbed Jake and pulled him to his feet, shouting in his face. Jake kept saying he didn't know anything, but they didn't believe him. The leader of the group, a tall man with a deep voice, told us to stay put. He sent the other 2 men to search the yacht. They tore through our belongings, overturning furniture, smashing open cabinets. We could hear the destruction from where we were lying on the deck. Lisa was shaking next to me. I reached out to hold her hand, trying to give her some comfort. Sarah was crying, and Tom was trying to keep Emily calm. We were all scared, not knowing what these men were capable of. After what felt like hours, the men returned. They didn't find whatever they were looking for. This seemed to make them even angrier. The leader grabbed me by the shirt and pulled me up. He demanded to know where we had hidden it. I told him again that we didn't know what he was talking about. One of the men suggested taking one of us as a hostage until they found what they were looking for. This made my blood run cold. I couldn't let them take Lisa or any of my friends. I had to think of something. I told the leader we had a safe on board, hoping to buy us some time. He ordered me to show him. I led him below deck, my mind racing. I had no plan, just a desperate hope to stall him. I showed him the storage room, pretending there was a hidden compartment. He pushed me aside and started searching. I took the opportunity to grab a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox. My hands were shaking, but I knew I had to act. I waited until his back was turned and then swung the wrench with all my strength. The leader fell to the ground, unconscious. I ran back up to the deck, shouting for my friends to help. We needed to get the other 2 men off the yacht. Tom and Jake grabbed some makeshift weapons, and we confronted the men. A struggle ensued. It was chaotic, terrifying. We managed to overpower one of the men, knocking him into the water. The other man, seeing he was outnumbered, jumped overboard and swam back to their boat. We quickly cut the ropes that tied their boat to our yacht and pushed it away. With the immediate threat gone, we checked on each other. Everyone was shaken, but no one was seriously hurt. We tied up the unconscious leader and locked him in one of the cabins. We radioed for help, explaining the situation to the Coast Guard. The wait for rescue felt like an eternity. We stayed together on the deck, keeping an eye on the cabin where the leader was locked up. When the Coast Guard finally arrived, we felt a wave of relief wash over us. The armed men were taken into custody. It turned out they were part of a smuggling ring, looking for a hidden package on our yacht. We never found out what it was or why they thought it was on our boat. The weekend that was supposed to be a fun escape turned into a nightmare. We were all shaken, but thankful to be alive. I decided to take a solo diving trip while on vacation. The sun was shining, the water was clear, and it seemed like a perfect day for an adventure. I geared up, double-checked everything, and jumped into the water. The cool ocean enveloped me, and I started my descent, excited to explore the underwater world. The coral reefs were beautiful, teeming with colorful fish. I swam deeper, mesmerized by the scenery. I had been diving for about 20 minutes when I noticed something unusual. There was a large shadowy figure in the distance, something that didn't quite belong there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I swam closer. As I got nearer, I realized it was a submerged container, the kind used for shipping. It was partially open, and I could see that it wasn't empty. My heart raced as I saw the contents, crates marked with strange symbols and bags that looked suspicious. I knew I shouldn't get involved, but I couldn't help it. I peeked inside one of the crates and saw packages wrapped tightly in plastic. It didn't take a genius to figure out what it was: drugs. My pulse quickened. I needed to get out of there. Just as I turned to swim back to the surface, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 divers were coming toward me, and they didn't look friendly. Panic set in. They must have seen me near their stash. I had to act quickly. I swam as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the other divers following me, their fins cutting through the water. I didn't know if I could outswim them, but I had to try. My lungs were starting to burn from the effort. I spotted a cave in the reef and darted inside, hoping they wouldn't see me. I pressed myself against the rocky wall, trying to steady my breathing. The cave was dark and narrow, but it provided some cover. I could hear the divers outside, searching. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, praying they wouldn't find me. Finally, I heard them swim away, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I needed to get to the surface and out of the water as quickly as possible. I took a deep breath and made a break for it. The ascent seemed to take forever. Every second felt like a lifetime. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the divers coming after me. But I was alone. When I finally broke the surface, I gasped for air, feeling a surge of relief. I quickly swam to my boat and climbed aboard, my hands trembling. I yanked off my gear and started the engine, desperate to put as much distance between me and that spot as possible. As the boat roared to life, I sped away, my heart still racing. Back on land, I felt a little safer, but I knew I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. Those divers were part of something big and dangerous. I reported what I found to the local authorities, who took my account seriously and launched an investigation. For the rest of my vacation, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I avoided the water and kept a low profile. I was haunted by the thought of what could have happened if those divers had caught me. It was a reminder of how quickly a perfect day can turn into a nightmare. Even now, I still think about that dive. It changed the way I view the ocean, a place that once brought me so much joy and peace. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings, knowing that danger can lurk where you least expect it. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of several individuals involved in the smuggling operation. It was a relief to know that my report had made a difference, but it didn't erase the fear I felt that day. It's a memory that will stay with me forever. Diving is still a passion of mine, but I've learned to respect the risks. The ocean is vast and mysterious, and while it holds incredible beauty, it also hides its dangers. I took my dog, Max, to a remote cabin for a summer vacation. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the city. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I was looking forward to some quiet time, just me and Max. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, swam in the lake, and relaxed on the porch. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were birds and the rustling of leaves. Max loved it too, running around and exploring. One afternoon, while we were on a hike, I heard gunshots in the distance. It startled me, but I assumed it was hunters. Hunting season wasn't for another month, though, which made me uneasy. I decided to head back to the cabin. As we walked back, I saw something that made my heart race. A group of men, about 5 of them, were gathered around a deer they had just shot. They were laughing and talking loudly. One of them noticed me, and their conversation stopped abruptly. I quickly turned and started walking away, trying to act normal. I didn't want any trouble. Max sensed my tension and stayed close. The hair on his neck was standing up. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. "Hey, you," one of the men shouted. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, faster now. Max crawled softly. The footsteps quickened. Panic set in. I broke into a run, Max sprinting beside me. I could hear them chasing us. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin was still a good distance away. I veered off the trail, hoping to lose them in the dense woods. Max followed, weaving through the trees. We ran for what felt like an eternity. My lungs burned, and my legs were weak. I glanced back and saw the men still pursuing us. They were closer now, shouting angrily. I needed to find a place to hide. I spotted a small cave and ducked inside, pulling Max with me. We crouched in the darkness, trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the men searching nearby. "She went this way," one of them yelled. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. Max was silent, sensing the danger. Footsteps approached the cave. I pressed myself against the cold rock wall, trying to make myself invisible. A shadow passed by the entrance. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out the words. They were so close. I closed my eyes, terrified. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. They were searching elsewhere. We stayed hidden for a long time, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I emerged from the cave, Max by my side. The woods were eerily quiet now. I knew we had to get back to the cabin and call for help. We moved cautiously, staying off the main trails. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. When we finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and closed all the curtains. I grabbed my phone and called the local authorities, explaining what had happened. They told me to stay put and that they would send someone right away. The wait was agonizing. I kept expecting the men to burst through the door at any moment. When the police arrived, I felt a huge wave of relief. They searched the area and found evidence of the poachers. It turned out they had been illegally hunting in the woods for some time. They were arrested, and I was assured it was safe. The rest of the vacation was ruined, of course. I couldn't shake the fear and anxiety. We left the next day, and I vowed never to return to such a remote place alone again. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, but it turned into a nightmare. Max and I are safe now, but the memory still haunts me. Every time I hear a sudden noise or see a shadow in the corner of my eye, I remember those terrifying moments in the woods. We had been looking forward to the music festival for months. The sun was high, and the air was filled with the sound of live music and the smell of food trucks. I was there with my friends, Jess, Mike, and Carla. We were all excited, dancing, and having a great time. As the day went on, the crowd grew. It became harder to move around, and we had to hold onto each other to avoid getting separated. At some point, we decided to grab some food. The lines were long, so we split up to save time. I went to get drinks while the others queued for burgers. I was standing in line, swaying to the music, when I felt someone watching me. I turned and saw a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a hoodie despite the heat, and his eyes were fixed on me. I felt a chill but tried to shake it off. It was a crowded festival. It could have been a coincidence. When I finally got the drinks, I headed back to our meeting spot. But my friends weren't there. I checked my phone and saw a message from Jess saying they had moved closer to the stage. I started weaving through the crowd, balancing the drinks, and looking for them. I felt that chill again. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the same man following me. Panic started to set in. I quickened my pace, but so did he. I couldn't see my friends anywhere. The crowd was too thick, and the music too loud. I tried calling Jess, but the signal was bad. The man was getting closer. I made a sharp turn and headed towards the edge of the festival grounds. There were fewer people here, and I hoped to lose him. I ducked into a tent selling festival merchandise, hiding behind a rack of shirts. I peered out and saw him searching, looking around with a focused intensity. My heart was pounding. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I spotted a security guard near the entrance of the tent. I made a beeline for him, trying to act casual but urgent. I told him about the man following me. The guard nodded and walked me out, keeping an eye on the crowd. We reached a more open area, but I still couldn't find my friends. The guard suggested we go to the security tent where they could help me. As we walked, I saw the man again. He was talking to someone, pointing in my direction. The guard noticed and picked up the pace. In the security tent, I felt a bit safer. The staff were kind, offering me water and helping me try to contact my friends. I kept checking the entrance, expecting the man to appear at any moment. The staff said they'd send someone to find my friends and bring them to the tent. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Jess, Mike, and Carla arrived. They were worried sick, and we hugged tightly. I explained everything that happened. The security staff assured us they were on the lookout for the man and that we could stay in the tent as long as we needed. We decided to leave the festival early. The fun was over for me. The staff escorted us to the exit, and we hurried to the parking lot. As we got to the car, I looked around, half expecting to see the man lurking. But there was no sign of him. The drive back was quiet. My friends tried to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the fear. I kept looking out the window, feeling like we were being followed. Once we got home, we double-checked the locks and tried to relax. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering who that man was and what he wanted. The festival was supposed to be a fun escape, but it turned into a nightmare. Days passed, and I started to feel a bit better. But the memory lingered. I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder. We never found out who the man was or why he was following me. The festival organizers said they'd investigate, but I never heard back. My friends were supportive, but I knew they couldn't fully understand the fear I felt. It was a lesson in how quickly things can change, how a day of fun can turn into a terrifying experience. I'm more careful now, always aware of my surroundings. We still go to festivals, but I stick close to my friends, and we never split up. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for weeks. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip to clear my head and enjoy some peace and quiet. I picked a trail that was known for its beautiful views and seclusion. It was supposed to be a break from the everyday grind. I set out early in the morning, eager to hit the trail before the heat set in. The hike was challenging but enjoyable, with the sun casting long shadows through the trees. I felt like I was finally alone with nature, which was exactly what I wanted. Around midday, I took a break by a small clearing. I was resting on a large rock when something shiny caught my eye. It was partially buried in the dirt. I brushed away the dirt and found a small metal box. It was locked, but I could see stacks of money through the gaps. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take the box with me. I carried it in my backpack and continued the hike. As the afternoon wore on, I began to think about what to do with the money. It was a lot of cash, and I knew I should probably hand it over to the authorities. But the thought of a quick windfall was tempting. When I reached the end of the trail and got back to my car, I noticed a couple of men in a nearby parking lot. They looked out of place, wearing expensive clothes and acting fidgety. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I was just being cautious after all. As I was loading my gear into the car, one of the men approached me. He asked if I had seen a box on the trail. I said no and tried to seem nonchalant, but I could tell he was getting nervous. He mentioned something about important documents that were missing. My heart began to race. I drove home quickly, feeling like I was being watched. When I got back to my place, I locked the doors and kept the box hidden. I tried to calm myself down, but the encounter with the men had shaken me. I decided to call the police and report what I had found. Before I could make the call, I heard a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw the same two men from the parking lot. My heart sank. I didn't open the door and just waited. The knocking grew louder, and the men started shouting through the door, demanding I open up. I was terrified. I picked up my phone and called 911, trying to stay calm. I could hear the men getting more agitated. They were saying things like, "We know you have it, and we need that box." They didn't seem like they were going to leave anytime soon. While I waited for the police, I considered my options. I couldn't stay in the apartment, and I couldn't let them know I had the box. I decided to slip out the back door and find a safer place to wait. I grabbed the box, put on a hoodie, and quietly left through the back entrance of the building. I made my way to a nearby park, hoping to find a place to hide. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the men to be following me. My mind was racing. I found a secluded spot near a large tree and sat down, trying to catch my breath. The police arrived at my apartment a short while later. I watched from a distance as they questioned the men and searched the area. I stayed hidden, hoping they would leave soon. Eventually, the men were taken away by the police, but I still didn't feel safe. After the situation was resolved, I went back to my apartment and handed the box over to the authorities. They were able to determine that the money was connected to a criminal investigation, and they were grateful for the information I provided. I was relieved that the ordeal was over, but the experience left me shaken. The thought of those men showing up at my door, demanding something I had, made me realize how dangerous some situations can become. I took a few days off to recover from the stress and made sure to change my usual routines. I was more cautious about my surroundings and made sure to always have a plan if something went wrong. The hike that was supposed to be a peaceful escape turned into a terrifying encounter. I had been traveling for a few weeks and decided to stay at a hostel in a small town I'd never visited before. It was a quaint place with a friendly atmosphere. I had been on the road alone for a while and was looking forward to meeting new people. When I arrived at the hostel, I noticed a group of travelers who seemed to be close friends. They were chatting loudly and laughing, and I immediately felt a bit of envy for their camaraderie. I introduced myself, and they welcomed me warmly. Their names were Tom, Lisa, and Jack. They told me they were on a road trip and had been traveling for months. Their stories were exciting, and they seemed like great company. I joined them for dinner that evening, and we spent the night sharing travel stories and plans. They invited me to explore the town with them the next day, and I happily accepted. The following morning, we set out together. They showed me around the town, and we had a great time. They seemed genuinely friendly, and I felt like I had found a new group of friends. We planned to spend the next few days together, seeing the sights and enjoying each other's company. On the third night, after a long day of sightseeing, we returned to the hostel. Tom suggested we go out for drinks. I was tired but agreed. We went to a local bar that had a relaxed vibe. The night was going well until Tom and Lisa started talking about something that made me uneasy. They were discussing a big score and seemed overly excited. Jack kept looking around as if he was worried about being overheard. I didn't understand much of what they were saying, but it sounded suspicious. I tried to brush it off as just talk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, Lisa and Jack seemed even more secretive. They kept talking in hushed tones and kept looking around nervously. I felt increasingly uncomfortable. When we went back to the hostel, I noticed they were acting even more strangely. They kept checking their phones and whispering to each other. Later that evening, I decided to investigate. I found a spot in the common area where I could overhear them talking. They were discussing something about getting the shipment and laying low. They also mentioned a rendezvous point. My heart raced as I realized that they might be involved in something illegal. I knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to confront them directly or accuse them of anything without evidence. I started thinking about how I could get out of the situation safely. I decided to keep a low profile and look for a way to leave without drawing attention. As the evening went on, Tom approached me and invited me to go with them to a secluded spot outside town. He said they wanted to show me a secret place they had discovered. I hesitated but agreed, trying to act normal. Inside, I was terrified, and my mind was racing with plans to escape. When we arrived at the spot, it was a small, rundown warehouse on the edge of town. The group went inside, and I followed, trying to stay calm. Once inside, I saw bags of what looked like contraband stacked in the corner. The sight confirmed my fears. They were definitely involved in illegal activities. I knew I had to get out before they noticed I was trying to leave. I made my way to the back of the warehouse and found a small window. It was barely big enough for me to squeeze through, but I had to try. I pushed and wriggled my way through the window and dropped down outside. I ran as fast as I could back to the hostel. My heart was pounding, and I could hear my breath echoing in my ears. When I got back, I grabbed my things quickly, trying to stay quiet. I didn't want to risk running into them again. I contacted the local authorities and reported what I had seen. I explained the situation and provided them with as much information as I could. They assured me they would investigate and take action. I was relieved but still scared. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept my distance from the hostel common areas and stayed in my room. I felt safe knowing that help was on the way. The authorities arrived shortly after and took statements from me and the other guests. They found evidence linking the group to the illegal activities. By the time the sun came up, the group was gone. The police had detained them, and I was finally able to breathe easy. I decided to cut my trip short and head home. The experience had shaken me, and I needed to feel safe again. I had always looked forward to our summer vacation, and this year we decided to take a cruise. It seemed like the perfect way to relax and see some new places. My husband, Mark, and I had booked a week-long trip on a large cruise ship. The first few days went smoothly. We enjoyed the sunny weather, great food, and the variety of activities the ship offered. One evening, as we were walking along one of the upper decks, we noticed a crew member who seemed out of place. His name tag read Chris, but there was something off about him. He didn't fit in with the rest of the crew, who were all cheerful and professional. This crew member moved too quickly and always seemed to be looking around nervously. We brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just new or had a rough day. But as the days passed, his behavior got stranger. He would often be seen around areas of the ship where crew members usually didn't go, and sometimes he would be in places where he shouldn't be, like the engine room or supply closets. One night, we were having dinner in the main dining room when we noticed Chris talking quietly with another crew member who seemed just as nervous. They were whispering, and whenever someone came close, they quickly changed the subject. Mark and I exchanged glances. It was clear something was not right. After dinner, we decided to follow Chris discreetly. We saw him sneak into a restricted area of the ship. The door was usually locked, but he had a key card and went in without hesitation. We were both curious and concerned. Mark suggested we go to the ship's security office and report our concerns, but I felt uneasy about doing that without more evidence. What if we were wrong and caused trouble for someone who was just having a bad day? That night, we couldn't stop thinking about Chris and his suspicious behavior. We decided to try and gather more information. The next morning, Mark noticed Chris in a quiet part of the ship, where he seemed to be transferring something from a large duffel bag into a small box. The whole situation was unsettling. We knew we had to act carefully. We didn't want to put ourselves in danger or make a mistake that could ruin someone's life. We decided to document what we saw as best as we could without drawing attention to ourselves. We used our phones to take discreet pictures of Chris and the areas he was visiting. Once we had enough evidence, we went to the ship's security office. We were anxious but knew it was the right thing to do. We showed the security officer our photos and explained what we had seen. He took us seriously and assured us he would investigate. The security officer asked us to remain on standby and avoid contact with Chris. We agreed and spent the day nervously waiting. We kept a low profile, avoiding any further encounters with Chris while hoping for the best. The idea of being on a ship with someone who might have dangerous intentions was frightening. Later that afternoon, we were called into the security office. The officer informed us that Chris had been apprehended. It turned out that Chris was indeed an imposter. He had managed to get a job on the ship by using fake credentials. The security team found that he had been planning to steal valuable items from the ship's safe and had also been involved in smuggling illegal goods. The authorities were notified, and Chris was taken into custody. It was a relief to know that we had helped prevent a potentially dangerous situation. The rest of our trip went smoothly, and we felt a lot safer knowing the threat was gone. I had always loved taking photos at local festivals. The colors, the energy, the people, it all made for great shots. Last summer, I was at a huge festival in a small town, snapping pictures of the parade, the food stalls, and the crowds enjoying themselves. I was walking around the festival grounds with my camera, capturing moments of people laughing and dancing. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything. I was at the edge of the festival, near a quieter area where the food vendors were setting up. That's when I saw something unusual. A group of men in dark clothing was huddled together behind one of the stalls. They seemed to be having a heated discussion, and I noticed a briefcase lying on the ground beside them. The way they were acting was odd, so I decided to take a few photos from a distance. I tried to be discreet, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As I reviewed the photos on my camera screen, I realized that one of the men was handing something to another. It looked like stacks of cash being exchanged for something small wrapped in paper. The whole scene felt shady. I knew I might have captured something illegal. Just as I was about to move away, one of the men turned his head and saw me. I could see his eyes widen, and he nudged the others. They all started looking around, and that's when I knew I was in trouble. I quickly turned and started walking back toward the festival's main area, trying to stay calm. I kept glancing back and saw that the men were following me. I could see them moving quickly through the crowd, making their way toward me. My heart began to race. I tried to stay calm and think clearly. The last thing I wanted was to confront them directly. I made my way toward the nearest food stall and ducked behind it. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local police, but before I could get through, I noticed that the men had split up. Some were still coming straight at me, while others seemed to be searching the crowd. I took a deep breath and tried to blend in with the festival goers. I moved slowly and carefully, keeping my camera close. I decided to try and lose them in the crowd. I weaved through groups of people, hoping the crowd would be enough to hide me. At one point, I ducked into a restroom and stayed there for a few minutes, listening carefully. I could hear the muffled voices of the men outside, and it sounded like they were still searching for me. I waited until their voices faded away, then carefully made my way out of the restroom. I had to find a safe place to hide the evidence I had. I couldn't just leave the photos lying around. I spotted a nearby park with some trees and bushes, and I headed in that direction. I found a secluded spot and hid my camera in a safe place. After making sure the camera was secure, I looked around for any sign of the men. They were still nowhere in sight. I decided it was best to head to the nearest police station and report what I had seen. I knew it was crucial to get the evidence into the right hands. When I arrived at the police station, I was nervous but relieved to finally be safe. I explained everything to the officers and showed them the photos. They took me seriously and assured me they would investigate the situation. They also asked me to stay in touch if I saw or heard anything more. After leaving the station, I went back to the festival grounds to retrieve my camera. I was careful not to attract attention. Once I had it, I made my way back to my car, still on edge but grateful to be out of immediate danger. I had managed to get home without further incident. The whole experience was terrifying and left me shaken, but I was relieved that I had done the right thing by reporting what I saw. The police later informed me that they had arrested the men and were investigating further. It felt like a weight had been lifted, knowing that my photos had helped stop something illegal. The rest of the summer was quiet, and I didn't take any more risks with my photography.